Picture this, the 41st millennium, a staging deck aboard an Imperial strike cruiser, 40 minutes before a drop. 200 space marines of a loyal chapter kneel in ranked silence, helmets off, heads bowed. And in front of them stands a figure in black ceramite. He wears a skull for a face. He carries a mace worked into the shape of the Imperial eagle. He raises it and he begins to recite. And 200 of the Emperor's finest answer him line by line, and every one of them means it with his whole soul. That man is a chaplain. He is the spiritual heart of his chapter, the keeper of its faith, the one who tells his brothers what they are dying for. There is a chaplain like him in every loyalist chapter in the galaxy. The black armor, the skull mask, the Crozius Arcanum, the litanies, the whole magnificent grim theater of it. Every single piece of that was invented by the traitors, not adapted from them, not accidentally similar. Invented wholesale by the 17th Legion, the word-bearers, the legion that would go on to start the largest civil war in human history and hand the galaxy to the ruinous powers. The Imperium looked at the most spectacular treachery in 10,000 years of records, and then it kept the uniforms, kept the ritual, kept the job title, and never quite got round to mentioning where any of it came from. And that is not even the good part. The good part is what they were punished for. Because in a little while we are going to get to a city called Monarchia, where the Emperor of Mankind burned an entire world's worth of temples to the ground and made an entire legion kneel in the ashes as a lesson in front of witnesses for one specific crime. And that crime was believing that the Emperor was a god and ought to be worshipped. Have a look around the Imperium of the 41st millennium and tell me how that lesson went. So let us do this properly. Let us talk about the legion that was built as a monument to the Emperor's mercy, that was held up as the model every other legion should copy, that was destroyed for its faith, and that then spent 10,000 years being proved right about absolutely everything. Let us talk about the word-bearers. In the beginning they were not called the word-bearers. In the beginning they were called the Imperial Heralds, and they were by some distance the strangest founding decision the Emperor ever made. Because when the Legiones Astartes were raised, most of them were recruited the way you would expect. Take a hard world, take the survivors of its harshest environments, put them through the process, and you get soldiers, perfectly sensible. The 17th was not raised that way. The 17th was raised out of the populations the Emperor had just finished conquering, the defeated. The ones who had stood against the Great Crusade lost and been folded into it. And this was not sloppiness or a shortage of candidates. This was a statement, and it was aimed squarely at every world that had not been reached yet. Look, it said, these are the people who fought me. Now they are my messengers. Not my slaves, not my prisoners, my heralds, who go before me and speak in my name. Resistance to the Emperor does not end in extermination. It ends in elevation. It was, and it is worth pausing on this, an act of genuine mercy performed for the express purpose of intimidating strangers, which is possibly the most imperial sentence in this entire script. So the Imperial Heralds went out ahead of the crusade, and their function was diplomatic before it was military. A world would look up and see a fleet in orbit, and then a shuttle would come down, and out of it would step figures in ritual black vestments. At their head walked one wearing a skull-faced mask, carrying an ornate mace, holding a scroll. You have already spotted it. That is a chaplain. That is, beat for beat, the chaplain we opened with 10,000 years early, standing on a landing pad in the 31st millennium, about to give your civilization the single most consequential sales pitch it will ever receive. The scroll was an offer of compliance. Join the Imperium. Accept the Emperor's authority. Pay the tithe, abandon your superstitions, and nobody has to be vaporized today. It was, on the whole, an excellent offer. A great many worlds took it. Those worlds joined the Imperium bloodlessly, and their populations went to bed that night thinking they had negotiated rather well. The ones that refused got the other thing. And the other thing was so thorough that within about 2 years, the Imperial Heralds had picked up a nickname. Other legions called them the Iconoclasts, and they did not mean it as a compliment, which tells you something, because these were men who solved most problems with orbital bombardment and were not generally squeamish. Here is what earned it. The imperial truth was, at this point, official doctrine. There are no gods. There is no warp sorcery, only unexplained science. Religion is a con that has been run on humanity for 30,000 years, and it is now closed. And most legions enforced that the way soldiers enforce anything, which is to say they knocked over the obvious temples, shot the obvious priests, filed a report, and moved on to the next war. The 17th did not do that. The 17th read the doctrine as written and then applied it with the enthusiasm of the recently converted, which is exactly what they were. They burned libraries, not the religious sections. The libraries, they took hive-sized archives of accumulated human knowledge and reduced them to slag, because somewhere in there was a creation myth. They scoured cave paintings. They went over cliff faces with cutting beams to remove carvings that predated agriculture. They cross-referenced folk songs. On at least one occasion, presented with a cathedral that could have been demolished in an afternoon by a work crew with charges, they instead called down an orbital strike, because a work crew might have left a wall standing and a lance strike does not leave walls. There is a sort of purity to it. Somebody told these men that the past was a lie, and instead of nodding along, they went out and killed the past, and the emperor loved it. This is not editorializing. This is on the record. Before Lorgar was found, the Imperial Heralds were held up as the standard, not the Ultramarines with their model civilization, not the Dark Angels with their 1,000-year pedigree. The legion made of the conquered, the one that scrubbed history off rock walls, was the one other legions were told to be more like: faithful, effective, absolutely without doubt. Remember that. Hold on to it for about 20 minutes, because it is going to matter enormously. They looked the part too, and it is worth describing, because almost nobody pictures them correctly. When people hear word-bearers, they think of the crimson, the red so dark it is nearly liver-colored, covered edge to edge in carved and burned scripture. That is not what they looked like. That came later. The Imperial Heralds wore gray. A worn, dark gunmetal gray, weathered down and shadowed at every recess, with the edges of the plate rubbed back to a dull metallic shine, not the polished silver of a parade unit. The shine a tool gets after years of use, where the paint has gone off the corners because the corners are what hit things. They looked like what they were: sombre, practical, and extremely tired. A legion dressed for work. The crimson came after the heresy, when they repainted the entire legion, and I want you to appreciate what that involved as an act of administration. 150,000 suits of power armor, individually stripped and refinished, and then every single one carved and branded with passages of scripture, by hand, one line at a time. Other traitor legions came out of the heresy and mutated, or degenerated, or went feral. The word-bearers came out of it and did a rebrand. There is a strange gap in the records here, and it is worth flagging because it is genuinely odd. We know very little about where the Imperial Heralds actually fought during this period. Other legions have campaign histories you can trace world by world. The 17th has a reputation for extraordinary effectiveness and almost no specific engagements attached to it. They were the best. Everyone agrees they were the best, and the details have gone missing. Which is either an accident of a galaxy-sized bureaucracy losing paperwork, or it is exactly what you would expect from a legion that would later have very good reasons to edit its own early history. Take your pick. I have taken mine. Then, on a world called Colchis, the Emperor found the 17th Primarch, and everything went sideways. Colchis was a dying world, dust and ruin and a civilization on the long slide down, and it was ruled by a church. Not influenced by one, ruled by one. A theocracy called the Covenant, worshipping a pantheon called the Powers, using a liturgical language holding real political authority. Now here is the detail that everybody skips and absolutely nobody should. That liturgical language, Colchisian, was not a made-up priest tongue. It has direct roots in the dark tongue, the actual language of the actual daemons of the actual warp, meaning that when a priest on Colchis knelt down and prayed to the Powers in Colchisian, on Colchis, something on the other side could hear him, not metaphorically, not as comfort. Something was listening, in a language it understood, at an address it recognized, which is why Colchis had miracles. Not many, and not often, but enough. Enough that on this one world out of a million worlds where faith was a beautiful lie people told to survive the week, faith actually paid out, occasionally, unpredictably, like a machine in a casino that is rigged in the house's favor and still, once in a while, has to let somebody win, or nobody would keep feeding it. That is the soil the 17th Primarch landed in, not a world that believed in gods, a world where the gods answered the phone. Now what happened next has two versions, because Games Workshop rewrote it, and I'm going to give you both because the old one is better, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. In the old telling, the Primarch was found by a priest called Corpheron, and Corpheron loved him. Immediately, completely, and for the rest of his life. He looked at what had fallen out of the sky and thought, "That is mine," and he raised him, and taught him letters, and listened to him. And when Lorgar began having visions of a golden figure who would come from the stars, who was a god, who was his father, Corpheron did not tell him he was imagining things. Corpheron went and started a holy war so that Colchis would be ready when the golden figure arrived. He did it himself, without Lorgar. He took fanatics and pointed them at other fanatics and burned the covenant down over a religious argument that was technically correct. And there is a scene in the old material where the great city is finally taken, and the old icons are being destroyed, and Corpheron stands at a window, watching it burn, and behind him Lorgar is curled up in the corner of the room with his hands over his ears, saying, "Father, I can hear them screaming. I can hear it." And Corpheron does not turn round. He watches the city and he says, "That will stop soon, my son. That is the sound of a religion ending." And Lorgar says, "I want them to stop." And then Corpheron does turn round and he goes to him and he puts his arms round him and he says, "Trust me, by morning it will be over." That is the old version. In the old version, this is a man who burned a planet's entire faith to the ground as a favor, because the one soul he loved was having bad dreams and needed a better world to wake up in. You could feel something for Lorgar in that version. He was not a soldier and never wanted to be. He was a theologian who had been handed an army. He wanted to win with words. He was the Primarch who found war distasteful, raised by a man who found it a reasonable Tuesday. In the current version, none of that happened. In the current version, Corpheron is a mid-ranking priest with a bad temper and not many followers, working his way from town to town, resentful that his offerings to the Powers are so small. Lorgar is found by a tribe who take him in and raise him. And when the tribe hears there is a passing priest who can read and write, they come and kneel in the dust and beg Corpheron to take their star-blessed foundling as a student. Corpheron looks at a demigod, and every human instinct in him screams to kneel, and he refuses to, because that is the kind of man he is. Instead, he tells Lorgar that if he wants to come along, he must prove his loyalty first, by killing the people who raised him, and Lorgar does it. The rest of that account is a long study in the abuse of something enormous by something small. Corpheron veers between affection and violence with no warning. He beats a Primarch with a lash and then complains that the marks heal too fast for the lesson to take, and it is all, we are told, in service of shaping a prophet, which is the excuse every abuser in every century has reached for. I will be honest with you about why I do not like the new version, and it is not sentiment. It is that it does not go anywhere. The new telling implies that Lorgar was in on it, that he was quietly permitting the old faith to survive underneath the new one, hedging, keeping an escape route open, a schemer. A grandmaster, fine, great, even. Except every book that comes after was written off the old version, and in every one of them Lorgar is not the grandmaster. He is the one being played by Corferon, by Erebus, and eventually by 4 entities so far above his weight class that the word played is generous. So we got a retcon that upgraded him to puppet master, followed by 100,000 pages of him being the puppet, which is its own kind of tragedy and not the intended one. Either way, the important thing happens. Lorgar takes over Colchis, tears down the old faith, and installs a new one. A single god, a golden figure, coming soon. And then the sky opens and the golden figure actually turns up on schedule, exactly as advertised, which on any other world would be the greatest religious vindication in recorded history, and on Colchis was Tuesday. The emperor came down, he met his son, and he gave him a present, and the present was the imperial heralds. 20,000 of the finest, most brutally effective, most doctrinally pure warriors in the crusade, handed over to a theologian, and then he left. He had a galaxy to conquer. He would not come back for a very long time. And what he had just done, without noticing, was hand the most fanatical legion in the Imperium to the one man alive who could give their fanaticism a direction he had not authorized. The first thing Lorgar did with his new legion was kill a lot of it. He established an internal body called the Brotherhood, which is a lovely name for what was essentially an ideological purge corps, staffed with the most devoted men he could identify, and he set them to work on the legion itself. Their targets were not traitors or cowards or the disloyal. Their targets were the men who were too loyal, specifically, too loyal to what the legion had been. Because the imperial heralds had spent decades burning books, and the word-bearers, as they were now renamed, were going to be writing them. The old legion existed to destroy faith. The new legion existed to spread one. And a warrior who had built his entire identity on smashing every altar he found now had to be told that altars were fine, provided they were the right altars, and that scripture was holy, provided the author was his primarch. Roughly half the legion could not make that turn. Half, not half of a company. Not half of a chapter. The 17th Legion removed something in the region of 50% of its own strength for insufficient enthusiasm about a doctrinal reversal. There is no equivalent event anywhere else in the Great Crusade. Nobody else did this. The Space Wolves did not do this. The Night Lords did not do this, and the Night Lords once bombed their own homeworld, and this happened, please note, while the Legion was in good standing. This was not the fall. This was the Emperor's model legion, doing quality control in the loyal period, with commendations on file. There was one other piece of housekeeping from that period, and it produced the single strangest individual in the Legiones Astartes. Lorgar asked his father for a favor. He wanted Corferon elevated. The problem was that Corferon was old, far too old for the implantation process, which is not a thing you can do to a grown man of advanced years and expect him to survive it. So they did something else to him, not the full genie seed. No new organs, no proper transformation. A program of genetic work that left him with an extended lifespan and enough of the physical uplift to stand near his son's warriors without looking like a pet. The Legion called him the Half-Astartes, and they did not mean it kindly, because what Corferon actually was, structurally, was nothing at all. He held no formal rank. He was not in the chain of command. He appears on no organizational chart. And he could, in practice, walk up to a company captain and kill him. And the captain was not permitted to resist, because Corferon was the Primarch's adoptive father, and the Primarch's authority covered him like a tarpaulin. Imagine that as a workplace. You are a company commander of the Legiones Astartes. There is a man with no job title who wanders the ship, and if he decides today is your day, your only correct response is to hold still. And because he could not physically match a space marine, Lorgar had the shortfall engineered away. Corferon was given a suit of Terminator plate built to be worn by a man who was not an Astartes, which is a sentence that should not be possible. Modern Terminator armor cannot do that. This was an upgraded cataphracti pattern rebuilt around an internal exoskeleton, using alloys lighter and more heat-resistant than anything in standard issue, and it worked without the neural ports a Marine would use, so he could move in it while feeling nothing through it. No tactile feedback, no pharmacopoeia, no integration. Just a very old man walking around inside a fortress that cost more than most chapters own. And then, because that still was not enough, Lorgar had a pair of unique power claws made for him. The claws of the Patriarch built specifically so that a mortal could fight Space Marines and win. That is the level of care we are discussing. Whichever version of Colchis you believe, whether Corferon raised Lorgar with love or with a lash, Lorgar spent the resources of a Space Marine Legion making sure the old man never had to lose a fight again. Sons are strange about their fathers. That is essentially the thesis of the entire Horus heresy. What emerged from the other side was the word-bearers, and they had one job, not conquest, conversion. And this is where the trouble starts, because conversion is slow. The way the Great Crusade was supposed to work was straightforward. Arrive, demand compliance, apply force if necessary, install a governor, leave a garrison, move on. A well-run legion could bring in dozens of worlds a decade. The Lunar Wolves under Horus went through systems the way a fire goes through a warehouse. The word-bearers arrived, achieved compliance, and then stayed. They stayed, and they built temples, enormous ones. They constructed a priesthood, they trained local clergy, they distributed scripture, they held services. They did not consider a world compliant when its governor signed the paperwork. They considered it compliant when its population believed. Which is, and I want to be fair here, actually the correct answer to the problem the Imperium spent the next 10,000 years failing to solve. A world that is garrisoned stays loyal while the garrison is there. A world that believes stays loyal after you leave. Lorgar had identified correctly the single greatest structural weakness in his father's entire project. He was also, by any reasonable measure, catastrophically behind schedule. In the time it took other legions to bring in hundreds of worlds, the word-bearers managed a handful. Not 100, a handful. You could count their compliances on your fingers and have fingers spare. Meanwhile, the Ultramarines were assembling an empire, the Lunar Wolves were breaking records, and the Emperor's most favored legion was on World 4, laying the foundations of a cathedral. And what were they teaching in these temples? That is the part that should have set off every alarm on Terra. Lorgar wrote a book, the Lectitio Divinitatis. His life's work and its argument was simple, elegant, and completely forbidden. The Emperor of mankind is not a very powerful man, he is a god. He should be worshipped as one. Which flatly contradicted the imperial truth, the founding doctrine of the entire Imperium, the thing the 17th Legion had personally enforced by melting libraries. There were two versions of this book, and this is a genuinely tantalizing piece of lore. The version we know about is the one written for ordinary mortals, and that is the one that spread. But there was an earlier, fuller edition, written for the Primarchs, brother to brothers, and it was apparently far more complete. Whatever was in it was considered suitable for demigods and not for the rest of us. We do not know what was in it. It is one of the great blank spaces in the record. We do know what his brothers did with their copies, and the answer is mostly nothing. Gilliman is said to have destroyed his on site, which, as we will see, ages beautifully. The word-bearers began printing the mortal edition in bulk and distributing it wherever they went. And here is a mystery nobody has ever satisfactorily explained. The Emperor did not stop them for decades. A legion was industrially manufacturing heresy, shipping it across a growing Imperium, and the response from Terra was silence. There are theories. The most entertaining is that the counterintelligence cells set up to detect exactly this sort of thing, had themselves been quietly infiltrated by believers. So the fanatics tasked with hunting fanatics kept looking at the paperwork and deciding it could wait. Which would mean the Imperium's first great religious movement survived its infancy because of an internal security failure, and honestly, that is so perfectly in character that I choose to believe it. What finally got the Emperor's attention was not the heresy, it was the productivity numbers. The Emperor came to a world called Kur, to its capital city, Monarchia, and he did not come alone. He brought the Ultramarines. He brought Malcador. He brought witnesses. Monarchia was the finest thing the word-bearers had ever made. Millions of people, a jewel of a city, every spire raised in the Emperor's honor, a population that loved him with a completeness no other world in the Imperium could match. It was Lorgar's showpiece. It was the proof of concept. He had brought his father the single most devoted city in human space. The Ultramarines destroyed it from orbit before the word-bearers arrived. They did not fight the population. There was nothing to fight. They evacuated it, and then they leveled the city methodically on the Emperor's order, and then they stood in the ruins and waited for the legion that had built it to come home. Malcador went down first and tried to handle it diplomatically. He was there to manage the thing, to deliver the censure without the humiliation. Lorgar struck him, put the sigillite on the ground, and then the Emperor arrived. What happened next is the single most consequential act of parenting in human history. He ordered the word-bearers to kneel, all of them in the ashes of their masterpiece, and the entire legion went down and could not get up. Because when the Emperor of mankind tells you to kneel, your knees are no longer a matter of personal opinion. Then he ordered the Ultramarines to remain standing. Read that again. It was not enough to punish them. They had to be punished in front of their brothers, while their brothers were specifically instructed to stay on their feet and watch. That is not discipline. That is a man who has decided the lesson requires an audience. And the lesson had two halves, and the second half is the one everybody forgets. The first half was theological. I am not a god. Stop this. You are wasting your time and your faith on something that is not true, and worse, you are teaching it to my subjects. The second half was administrative. You are the slowest legion in my crusade. I gave you the finest warriors in the galaxy, and you have produced a rounding error. Stop building cathedrals and start taking worlds. So the message Lorgar received, standing in the powdered remains of the most beautiful thing he had ever built, was, everything you are is wrong, everything you believe is a delusion, and your output is unacceptable. Now get up and work harder. The Emperor then left, and he left behind a contingent of custodian guard, ostensibly as honor guard, actually as supervision. Remember them. They are about to have the worst century of professional performance in the history of the Imperium. Lorgar broke, not immediately, and not visibly. What he did first was retreat into himself for a solar month and speak to almost nobody. He took up self-flagellation. He would not eat. He had built his entire existence, his legion, his book, his cities, his understanding of the universe, on one proposition, and his father had personally flattened a metropolis to demonstrate that the proposition was worthless. And there were exactly two people he would still talk to, Corferon and the first chaplain, a man named Erebus. You could not design a worse pair of grief counselors if you were being paid to, because both of them had a secret, and it was the same secret. They had never stopped believing in the old gods of Colchis, not once. The whole imperial faith project, the Lectitio, the temples, all of it had been for them a very long detour, and now the detour had ended in a demolished city. And their prophet was sitting in the dark asking what the point of anything was. So they answered him. They did not argue that the Emperor was a god after all. That was the clever part. They agreed with him. They said, "You are right. He is not a god. He said so himself, and he is not lying, and your instinct was never wrong, only your aim. You were built to worship. The universe does contain gods. They are simply not him." And Lorgar, who had just watched his father erase a city to prove that faith was worthless, was in precisely the right condition to hear it. But he did not take it on trust, and this is the part that makes him interesting rather than merely pitiable. He went and did the research. He went back through the records of every world he had complied, and every world his brothers had complied, and he pulled the ethnographic reports, the ones that dutifully catalogued each local religion right before it was suppressed, and he laid them side by side, 50 religions, 100. From worlds that had been isolated from one another for tens of thousands of years, that had never traded, never met, never shared a single word, and they kept telling the same 4 stories: a god of war and slaughter, a god of decay and endurance, a god of excess and sensation, a god of change and knowledge. Different names, different faces, different rituals, on worlds separated by the width of the galaxy and by millennia of silence. Now you can explain that. Psychologists would say those are simply the 4 things a mind under pressure produces. Common human experience generating common myth. That is the boring answer, and it is not obviously wrong. Lorgar looked at it and reached the other conclusion. Independent witnesses across impossible distances, describing the same 4 entities, are not evidence of psychology. They are evidence of subject matter. The gods were real. Everyone had been describing them badly. And here's the thing that should genuinely unsettle you. Given his evidence, his method was not bad. He gathered data. He looked for correlation. He found one, and he formed a hypothesis. The hypothesis happened to be correct. The chaos gods are real. They are exactly 4 in the relevant sense, and human religions across the galaxy have been sensing them for 30,000 years. Lorgar did not fall because he was stupid or weak. He fell because he ran a decent investigation, got the right answer, and then made the one catastrophic error available to him, which was to assume that things which are real must therefore be worth worshipping. The universe contains predators. It does not follow that you should join a congregation for them. Meanwhile, an interesting thing was happening to the Legion's output figures. They shot up. The word-bearers reorganized, rebuilt their strength past 100,000, and began taking worlds at a rate they had never managed before. Terra's records show a Legion that received a stern talking to and dramatically improved. Terra's records did not show what the temples were being used for now, because the word-bearers had not stopped building, they had not stopped preaching. They had not stopped writing scripture and training clergy and converting populations. They had simply changed one variable, and the variable was which god. Everything else about the procedure remained in place, including the paperwork, which continued to say compliance achieved. Lorgar called these the Dark Crusades. The Imperium called them excellent work and stopped worrying about him. There is one more thing from this period that we know happened and cannot see, and it drives me slightly mad. Lorgar began synchronizing his campaigns with those of the Thousand Sons. He and Magnus spent a great deal of time in the same places at the same time, and they talked repeatedly at length. 2 of the most learned beings in the galaxy, one of whom had just concluded that the warp contains gods, the other of whom was the foremost human authority on the warp, and was insisting to anyone who would listen that it did not contain gods, only forces that could be understood and managed. And there is essentially no record of what was said. What survives is one fragment. The 2 of them retire into a tent and argue for a very long time, and when it ends, Magnus comes out looking as if the ground has shifted under him, and Lorgar comes out radiant. And Lorgar says, "Thank you, brother, thank you." And Magnus says, "You understand that I meant something else entirely," which is, for my money, the most frightening exchange in the entire heresy, because Magnus was not trying to convert him. Magnus was trying to correct him, and somewhere in the correction he handed his brother the piece he had been missing, and watched him walk out of the tent with it. The most brilliant sorcerer in humanity spent an evening explaining to a fanatic exactly why he was wrong, and the fanatic took notes. There is one campaign from this period that has never been explained, and it is the best mystery in the whole word-bearer's file. There was a chain of systems out towards the east, a cluster of worlds notable for producing psychers in extraordinary numbers, and notable also for wanting to join the Imperium. They said so repeatedly. They let Imperial traffic pass unmolested. They petitioned to be brought into compliance. When word reached Gilliman that a nest of spikers was volunteering to join up, he was delighted, and he dispatched an honor guard, 70 ultramarines in ceremonial dress, to receive them formally. By the time that honor guard arrived, the word-bearers had already been. 3 of the systems were dead, not conquered, exterminated, planets cracked, nothing left but tumbling rock. The 4th had been taken intact, and there was not a living soul on it, not a body, either, in the case of the spikers. Ordinary corpses? Yes, the psychers had gone somewhere. The word-bearers filed a report, and the report was completely reasonable. There had been an uprising. The local psychers had been enslaving passing crews, holding their minds. The word-bearers had attempted to negotiate, had been fired upon, and had responded. Regrettably, the population was too compromised to save. Regrettably, the losses taking the First World were severe enough that exterminating the other 3 was the responsible option. Picked captures attached, showing Lorgar personally in the field, showing the capital burning. The ultramarine officer sent to receive the surrender of a friendly power found himself standing on a station full of deliberately erased data, holding a document that answered every question and explained nothing. And he did the thing everybody in the Imperium does when the story does not add up, but the source is unimpeachable. He filed a request for clarification, and he left. Nobody knows what happened out there. It might have been exactly as reported. It might have been the largest sacrifice conducted up to that point in human history, performed on a population selected for psychic sensitivity by a legion that had recently developed a professional interest in that sort of thing, and then tidied up with an orbital bombardment and a bit of admin. I have an opinion. I suspect you do too, which brings us to Erebus, and I want to give him his due, because he is the most consequential mortal in the entire Horus heresy, and he started with nothing whatsoever. Erebus was born a slave on Colchis, no status, no education, no prospects, no name worth recording. What he had was patience and an eye for an opening. He used to climb a tree near a temple where the sons of the powerful were sent to be educated, and he would sit up there and listen to the lessons. That is how he learned to read. Not taught, not permitted. Stolen, one overheard lecture at a time, from up a tree, by a slave who had worked out that literacy was the door, and nobody was ever going to open it for him. And when the students were sent on pilgrimage to the capital, Erebus waited on the road for one of them, killed him, hid the body, took his documents, and took his name. He is not called Erebus. Erebus is a dead student whose identity he is still wearing, and the implication of that is one of the coldest ideas in the setting, because in this universe, a true name is not a formality. A true name is a handle. It is how a daemon holds you, how a god commands you, how anything from the other side gets a grip. The ruinous powers do not know his real name. He murdered the only man who could have told them on a road, before any of it started, in what he thought at the time was a play for a place at a school. He rose fast. First chaplain of the word-bearers, which meant that when the legion started seeding chaplains into other legions, and it did, as a doctrinal reform that the Imperium thought was a lovely idea, Erebus had a professional excuse to be inside everyone's command structure. The word-bearers also brought the concept of the warrior lodge, the informal inner circle, the brotherhood within the legion that officers do not get told about, chaplains in every legion, lodges in every legion. Introduced by the word-bearers, adopted enthusiastically, running for decades before anybody thought to ask who had suggested it. The heresy did not begin at Davin. The heresy began when the Imperium accepted a helpful administrative suggestion from a legion that had already changed sides and not mentioned it. Erebus eventually became something the Chaos Gods do not hand out often, which is a hand of the gods. That is not a title, it is a license. It means the four of them speak to you directly, and it means you are permitted latitude that would get anyone else torn apart. You can kill people the gods might have preferred alive. You can nudge history sideways. What you cannot do is fail to deliver the outcome. How Horus falls is your business. That Horus falls is not negotiable, and he had a sense of humor which somehow makes it worse. After Monarchia, he took a copy of the Imperial Truth, opened it to the passages he found most amusing, mounted it on a great staff, ringed it in an 8-pointed star, and set a human skull at the head of it with a crown sawn off and a flame burning out of the opening. He built that specifically because it resembled Malcador's staff. He carried a parody of the Emperor's regent around a galaxy that had not yet noticed anything was wrong, and nobody got the joke for decades, which is precisely the sort of thing that makes a man insufferable at parties. Now back to the custodians. You will recall the Emperor left a contingent of custodian guard with the word bearers after Monarchia. Watchers, the finest warriors humanity has ever produced, individually superior to Space Marines, loyal beyond any possibility of subversion, placed specifically to keep an eye on a Primarch who had just been publicly humiliated. Over the following century, here is a partial list of what happened under their supervision. The Legion converted to the worship of the ruinous powers. The Legion purged itself a second time, removing another fifth of its strength, including most of the veterans who still carried Imperial Herald honors. The Legion's crusades began systematically converting compliant Imperial worlds to chaos. The Primarch personally traveled into the Eye of Terror. Members of the Legion returned from that trip with demons living inside them, and the custodians noticed none of it. 100 years, a fifth of the Legion vanishes, the old guard specifically, and nobody files anything. Space Marines start coming back from expeditions with additional passengers, and it does not come up. Worlds are being converted under the Imperial flag, on the record, in the reports and the Watchers watch. I have thought about this for some time, and I have concluded there is no innocent explanation. The Emperor's own bodyguard, the golden incorruptible spear of humanity, were placed inside the exact Legion that was about to end the Imperium, given one job, and produced a century of nothing. The Custodes managed to lose the entire plot before the Emperor even sat down on the throne. Right? The Eye. Lorgar took his search to Cadia, which at this point was not a fortress world with the Imperium's finest infantry on it. It was a backwater beside a hole in reality, populated by people living at a pre-industrial level and mutating enthusiastically. The famous violet eyes of Cadians are not a fashion. They are what happens to a population that lives that close to the warp for that long. And there he found a witch called Ingathel, who had been expecting him and who explained the shape of the universe to him. She told him about the fall of the Elder, about the birth of the fourth god, about the eye itself being the wound that birth left, and she told him what he had to do, which was to sail into the Eye of Terror without a Jello field. Now Lorgar was many things, but he was not personally suicidal, so he did the thing that senior management always does with an unproven and potentially fatal procedure. He sent someone else first. He sent a detachment under a captain named Argil Tal, one of the finest warriors in the Legion, and they flew into the warp with the only barrier between a human soul and the immaterium switched off. What happened to them aboard that ship is genuinely horrible. Time stopped meaning anything. Much of the crew went mad, and much of the rest died, and the Astartes who survived did so by eating the mortals, because there was no other way to still be alive when the ship came out again, and nobody could say how long the crossing was going to take, and they were shown things. A vision of the past, of the Emperor's laboratory, of the Primarchs in their capsules, and of the moment the protective wards failed and the warp reached in and scattered all 20 of them across the galaxy. Argil Tal was shown the mechanism, and shown a hand on the switch, and given very strongly to understand whose hand it was, which we now know was a lie. The gods showed him a highly persuasive piece of theater in order to secure a specific reaction, and got it. That is worth sitting with, because it is the pattern for the entire heresy. Nobody was ever forced. They were shown a compelling video and asked to draw the obvious conclusion, and every single one of them drew it. Argel came back out with something inside him. A daemon called Rom, and the arrangement was not conventional possession, or at least it was not supposed to be. The Galvorbak, as they were called, were meant to be a genuine merging. Two souls, one from each side of reality, slowly growing together into a third thing that had never existed before. And that is how it was sold to Lorgar, and you can see why it worked. He was told his legion could become genuinely numinous, not messengers of the divine. There is a wonderful moment when the returned Argel is being debriefed, and the daemon inside him starts getting cocky and snarls at the Primarch, and Lorgar, without breaking stride, cracks it across the room, waits for it to reassemble itself in the chair, and calmly resumes taking notes. Then Lorgar went in himself, and got the tour, and on the way home found the avatar of Cain, an incarnation of the elder war god, injured and unable to flee, and strangled it. He came back changed. The gods had taught him how to actually use his power, and he had a great deal of it. He got to the point where he would boast about it to Magnus, which went about as well as boasting to Magnus about psychic ability always goes. Magnus let him talk, then took away the protections around his soul with a gesture, allowed the demons about 10 seconds of access, and put them back. The conversation ended shortly afterwards, and with that the pieces were set. The Primarch was converted, the Legion was converted, chaplains and lodges were installed across the Legiones Astartes. The custodian supervision had achieved 100 years of nothing. All that remained was to find someone to take the blame, because Lorgar could not lead this. Everybody knew about Monarchia. A rebellion led by the Legion that had been publicly disciplined would look exactly like what it was, which is a grudge, and grudges do not attract followers. But Horus Lupercal, War Master, the Emperor's favorite, the most beloved being in the Imperium, with no grievance anybody could point to, Erebus went to Davin. He put himself at Horus's side during the War Master's promotion to Supreme Command, made himself indispensable, volunteered for the tedious administrative work nobody wanted, and became the trusted aide of the most powerful man in the galaxy after the Emperor. Then he arranged for Horus to be mortally wounded, arranged for the only available cure to be located in a temple of the Serpent Lodge, and arranged for that cure to come with terms. Everything after that is the heresy, and you know the heresy. Istvan, the Loyalists in the drop zone, the virus bombs, 7 years of galactic civil war, 10,000 years of consequences. I will pick out only the parts that are ours. At Istvan V and the drop site massacre, there is a small scene that tells you everything about the two men at the center of this. Lorgar is preparing to fight, and Corferon comes up to him and suggests that he stay back, that this sort of work is not for him, that he has never liked bloodshed, and Lorgar pushes him aside and says, "I am not the son you knew. I have been changed." And Corferon, genuinely bewildered, says, "You tell me not to call you my son, and yet my son is the only thing you have ever been." The abuser and the abused, or the father and the son, depending which version of Colchis you accept, standing in the middle of the worst betrayal in human history, having the same argument they have been having for 2 centuries. Then Korax nearly takes Lorgar's head off, and Conrad Kersey has to intervene and tell him to go away and let the adults handle it, which is not a sentence anybody enjoys hearing from Conrad Kersey. Then comes Calth, and Calth is the word-bearer's masterpiece. Lorgar had worked out the strategic problem before anybody else. Horus could beat the Emperor's armies. What Horus could not beat was Ultramar, an entire self-sufficient empire under the most capable administrator in the species. sitting intact behind the front line ready to relieve Terra. So Lorgar took his legion, now over 150,000 strong, and 3 of the largest warships ever constructed, and he went to destroy Ultramar. Those ships deserve a moment because they are one of the great forgotten flexes of the heresy. They were the Abyss class, and there were only ever 3 of them. The Furious Abyss, the Trisagion, and the Blessed Lady, they were not a variant of the Gloriana. They were the next thing after it, and the comparison people reach for is that a Gloriana beside an Abyss looks like a light cruiser beside a battleship. Only the phalanx itself was bigger. They were shaped like a trident. They carried experimental plasma lensing that had barely entered service anywhere else. They carried psychic warheads, which are exactly what they sound like, munitions that detonate and kill every psychically active soul aboard an enemy vessel, which in practice means the navigators, which in practice means the ship is now a very large sealed room that will never move again. And each one had mounted at its center and chained to the hull an enormous golden book. 3 of the most powerful warships ever built by human hands, and the word-bearers looked at all that tonnage and thought, yes, but is it clear enough that we are the Scripture Legion? So Lorgar took them and went to Ultramar. Not conquer it. Seal it. The plan was the ruined storm. Take the small warp anomaly known as the Maelstrom, feed it with the death of an entire population, and inflate it into a barrier across the whole region, so that Guilliman would be sitting behind a wall of screaming immaterium, unable to move a single ship towards Terra. It worked. Kalth burned. The ruined storm went up. Ultramar was cut off for years, and Terra fought its siege without the one army that might have relieved it. And in the middle of that, Corferon went freelance. Lorgar told him to withdraw. Corferon had other plans because he had begun to feel the attention of the gods on him and had decided to earn it. He was going to do to Guilliman what had been done to Horus. He ambushed him, brought him down with sorcery, and drove an athem into his throat. An athem is not a knife. It is a shard of the weapon called the anathem, and it wounds things that cannot ordinarily be wounded. It is what put Horus on his back and delivered his soul to the gods for editing. And the anathem itself is one of the nastiest objects in the setting. So let us take a detour, because you will enjoy it. A Xenos species, a long time ago, decided to make a weapon that could kill gods. And the method they chose was to feed their entire civilization into it, not a sacrifice of volunteers. The species, they ceased to exist in order to become a blade. What they produced is hungry. It wants blood, and more than blood it wants names, because a name is the handle, and a thing that takes your name takes rather more than your life. And the Chaos Gods themselves were nervous about it, which is not a sentence you get to write often. Not because it could end them permanently, it could not, but because it could kill them, and they would have to come back, and being killed is undignified when you are supposed to be a fundamental force. So when Erebus arranged for Horus to be cut with it, a promise was made. The anathem was to be given the War Master's name, and then it was cheated. Horus's name was spoken, but his soul went to the ruinous powers instead, and the weapon that had eaten an entire species in order to be born did not get its meal. The gods then had the anathem broken into fragments and scattered, which is the standard approach to an asset that has become a liability, and those fragments turned up in the hands of exactly the sort of people you would expect. Fulgrim carried one around for a while. Erebus put one into the back of the finest warrior in his own legion. A species killed itself to make a weapon capable of murdering gods, and the gods stiffed it on the payment and then had it snapped into pieces and handed out to their staff as knives. There is no morality tale in this setting more efficient than that one. Robute Guilliman, who has a reputation as the boring one, had his throat opened by a blade that exists to kill demigods, and simply refused to die of it. He got up, with the wound closing by force of will, and Corferon ran away. Half a Primarch's worth of the heresy's outcome hinged on a mortal priest deciding to gamble, and the gamble failed by about 2 seconds and a bodyguard of Terminators. And then Erebus killed Argil Tal.
This is the moment I would put in front of anyone who wanted to know what the word-bearers actually are, because it is not a battle, it is a conversation. Argil Tal and his daemon had, by then, merged so far that the distinction had blurred, and the demon Raum had started asking questions, not human questions.
Just the obvious ones. What is this for? Why do we do this? Was any of it worth what your father gave up? And Argil Tal, who had gone into the warp without a Gellerfield on his Primarch's order and come back carrying a god's parasite, asks the demon inside him whether it wants to turn back, and Raum says, "We cannot." And Argil Tal asks why not, and Raum says, "You trusted Erebus. I have already seen our death." And the knife goes in from behind, and Erebus pulls out the Atham and says, "My son," in the affectionate way he always said it to the man he had just murdered from behind. Lorgar wept. Lorgar tried to have him destroyed, and did eventually exile him, because Erebus had not only killed the finest warrior in the Legion, he had killed the future Lorgar had been shown, the beautiful merged thing his sons were supposed to become. But by then it was far too late, and Lorgar had put him in charge of everything for 100 years, and there is a lesson in there about who you promote. Then Terra Lorgar, by this point, had noticed that Horus was failing. Russ had put a spear through him. A moment of the old Horus had surfaced, and the War Master was leaking, and Lorgar, who never stopped being ambitious about his position in the Pantheon, saw an opening and tried to take it. He gathered Fulgrim, using Fulgrim's true name to compel him, which raises the interesting question of how Lorgar came to know Fulgrim's true name, and moved against Horus with the intention of taking the War Master's place as the chosen of Chaos. He was beaten senseless in about the time it takes to describe it. Horus threw Fulgrim aside, stood over Lorgar, considered killing him, and did not. And the not killing was somehow more humiliating. Lorgar was dismissed, and withdrew with part of his legion, and was not present for the assault he had spent 2 centuries engineering. The word-bearers were there, though, in enormous numbers, and they did the single most important thing that happened during the siege of Terra. The Emperor had a psychic ward over the planet. Not a shield in the physical sense, a prohibition. It meant demons could not manifest. No daemon Primarchs, no daemon engines. Nothing from the other side could get a foothold, and every entity that tried burned. A word-bearer named Zadu Layak broke it by sacrificing himself, and a great many others in a ritual whose sole purpose was to unmake it. That is the hinge. Everything before it is a conventional siege the Loyalists might have won. Everything after it is terror with the door to hell propped open. Angron on the wall, demons in the palace. The whole final act. Not one of the great Primarch duels changed the outcome as much as one dark apostle undoing a piece of psychic architecture. And then it was over, and Horus was dead, and the traitors ran, and the word-bearers went home to the Eye and found that they had come out of it rather well. Lorgar's position on the loss was that he had seen it coming, had told the gods he should have been their chosen instrument, had been refused, and that whatever followed was therefore their problem. The Pantheon, in his view, had lost the war entirely by itself. Then Corax came for him. Corvus Corax spent the aftermath of the heresy-hunting traitors, and he found Lorgar's operation on a world where the word-bearers were building warp arches to move troops between systems. Word-bearers started dying in ways that suggested a demon, which was reasonable, because it involved a lot of ravens tearing men apart. And demon was the obvious answer. Lorgar came in person to deal with it and discovered that the ravens were not a demon. There were Corax, who by that point was not entirely a person anymore, and who very nearly took his head off. Lorgar escaped through an arch and smashed the arch behind him, holding his own throat together, and went up into a tower on his fortress world. And that is where he has been ever since. 10,000 years in a tower, in meditation, occasionally emerging in visions to torment his sons, and mostly not coming out at all. He is one of the very few demon primarchs who does not campaign, because somewhere out there is a raven, and he has met it. Erebus took over the Legion, near enough. He built the Dark Council, and from behind it he ran the Word-bearers, while his Primarch sat in a tower. Corpharon, who had never accepted being outranked by a man he considered a jumped-up slave, tried to organize a third purge to sweep the council away and failed, and was allowed to keep a small court and no real power. The slave who stole a name off a dead student ended up running the Legion that ended the Imperium over the head of a Primarch and the Primarch's own adoptive father. There is one last piece of theater I cannot leave out, because it is the funniest thing in the entire file. Corpharon was given custody of a Gloriana-class battleship. These are the vessels the Primarchs themselves command, kilometers of irreplaceable ancient warship, and there are barely a handful in existence. He was moving it between systems with a skeleton crew, 250 word-bearers aboard. Not 250,000, which is roughly the minimum a Gloriana needs to function properly. 250 warriors, no gun crews to speak of, and fighters in the launch bays with nobody to fly them. His reasoning was presumably that nobody attacks a Gloriana, and to be fair to him, that is normally true. The Ultramarines attacked the Gloriana. 2 companies of them, plus an entire chapter of their successors. The Nemesis chapter, who took catastrophic losses getting aboard and then spent a month fighting their way up through the ship deck by deck, and they took it. They took an intact Gloriana-class battleship off the word-bearers, renamed it Lex Talionis, and it is still in service. Corpharon lost a battleship the size of a small city because he could not be bothered to crew it, and a chapter that started that day with nothing ended it owning a vessel that Primarchs are supposed to command. So, 10,000 years later, the word-bearers are still out there, and they are the most doctrinally serious of all the traitor legions. Not the strongest and not the most numerous, but the ones who actually believe. Every other traitor legion is in it for something, for slaughter, or ascension, or sensation, or spite. The word-bearers are in it because it is true. They are the missionaries. They still convert worlds, still build temples, still print scripture, still train clergy. They are doing for the other side precisely the job the Emperor originally created them to do, and the Imperium is a theocracy. The Emperor is worshipped as a god by every human being in the galaxy who is not actively a heretic. The ecclesiarchy is one of the most powerful institutions in existence. There are shrine worlds whose entire population exists to pray. The imperial creed teaches that the master of mankind is divine and must be venerated, and to say otherwise out loud in public is heresy punishable by death. That is the Lectitio Divinitatis. That is Lorgar's book. That is the argument for which the Emperor personally raised Monarchia and put 20,000 space marines on their knees in the ashes while their brothers were ordered to stand and watch. Lorgar was not wrong. He was early. And in the most recent chapters of this saga, Rebute Gilliman came back from the dead into an Imperium that had spent 10 millennia worshipping his father, and began quietly to wonder whether there might be something in it after all. And he went looking for the fullest, most complete argument for the Emperor's divinity ever written. Gilliman, who destroyed his own copy on receipt. Gilliman, who stood in the ruins of Monarchia among the standing Ultramarines while the word-bearers knelt. He spent a fortune and employed a rogue trader and hunted across the galaxy for a Primarch's edition of the Lectitio Divinitatis, and in the end one was found and brought to him. And the scene ends with the Lord Commander of the Imperium alone with the book, taking a long breath and opening it, to read the argument his brother made that his father demolished a city to refute. So let us go back to that staging deck, 40 minutes before the drop. The chaplain in the black armor and the skull mask raises his Croceus, and 200 loyal space marines answer him, and every word of the ritual is word-bearer, and every line of the theology is Lorgar's, and not one man in that chamber knows it, and it would not matter if they did. He tells them that the emperor is a god. He tells them their deaths have meaning because a divine being is watching. He tells them to have faith, and the Imperium executes people for saying that the emperor is only a man. Lorgar lost the war. He lost his legion's honor, his primarch's dignity, his father's regard, his best warrior to a knife in the back, and 10,000 years to a tower with a raven outside it. He also won the argument so completely that the winners rebuilt their entire civilization around it and then made it illegal to disagree. That is the word-bearers, the legion that was made out of the defeated, held up as the model, punished for its faith, and proved right by everyone who punished it. They were told to stop preaching that the emperor was a god. Look how that turned out.